My professor failed my organic chemistry final after I turned down his dinner invitation. I've been telling everyone I'm acing organic chemistry when really I've been struggling since day one. My parents think I'm pre-med material and keep bragging to relatives about my future doctor-daughter. The truth is, I failed the first quiz and have been copying homework from my roommate Haley, who took the class last year. I changed enough answers to make it look different, but kept the same work so I could explain it if asked. Professor Kelly never asked, though. He just started keeping me after class to discuss my potential. At first, it seemed helpful. He'd explain reactions and mechanisms while standing just a little too close. He'd touch my shoulder when I got something right and say I was his brightest student. I knew I wasn't, but I needed him to think I was smart, so he wouldn't look too closely at my homework. Then 6 weeks ago, he asked if I wanted to continue our discussions over coffee. I said I was too busy with other classes. He said he understood, but my next homework came back with a D, even though I'd copied Haley's exactly, and she'd gotten an A on the same assignment last year. When I asked about the grade, he said my work lacked depth and offered again to help me outside of class. This time he suggested dinner at this Italian place downtown. I made an excuse about having a boyfriend. The next assignment came back with an F. He wrote that my work showed clear signs of academic dishonesty, but he was willing to give me a chance to improve with personal tutoring. By midterms, I was failing. Every assignment got worse scores no matter how careful I was with Haley's work. Professor Kelly stopped being subtle. He'd mention how beautiful I looked confused by chemistry concepts, and how he could make everything clear if I'd just let him. He started texting me from his personal number asking if I'd reconsidered his offer to help. The texts came late at night asking what I was doing and if I was alone. I never responded, but he kept sending them. Last week was the final exam. I studied harder than I've ever studied for anything. I actually knew the material this time. But when I got to the test, the version he handed me was different from everyone else's. The problems were graduate-level organic synthesis, things we'd never covered. I looked around and everyone else was working on normal problems about basic reactions. I tried my best but knew I was failing as I wrote. After the exam, Professor Kelly asked me to stay behind. He said he was disappointed in my performance this semester, but there were other ways to show mastery of the subject. He put his hand on my knee and said one dinner could change everything. I pulled away and left without saying anything. Yesterday, grades posted. F in organic chemistry. My GPA dropped below the requirement for my scholarship. My parents were devastated and demanded to know what happened. I couldn't tell them the truth about copying homework, because then they'd know I'd been lying all semester. So I just said Professor Kelly was a tough grader. My dad decided to call the department to discuss it. That's when things got strange. The department secretary said Professor Kelly had mentioned me often. Apparently I was getting special tutoring at his house on Thursday nights. He'd logged it as office hours with the department. She said his wife, June, had even called once to confirm I'd be coming for dinner after tutoring, but I've never been to his house. On Thursday nights, I work at the campus bookstore. My manager can confirm I've been there every week. I looked up Professor Kelly's address, and it's 40 minutes from campus in this suburban neighborhood. Then I checked his office hours log, which the department posts online. Every Thursday for the past 3 months, he's listed a tutoring session with my name from 6 to 10 p.m. at his home address. The notes say I'm receiving remedial instruction in advanced organic synthesis. The same topics were on my different final exams. My roommate Haley said this sounded familiar. Her friend Lisa took Professor Kelly's class 2 years ago and had something similar happen. Lisa was also failing after refusing his advances, but then Lisa suddenly withdrew from the class mid-semester and changed her major. Haley reached out to Lisa yesterday. Lisa said Professor Kelly had been documenting fake tutoring sessions with her too. His wife had even called Lisa once, asking why she hadn't shown up for dinner. Lisa got scared and dropped the class. She never reported it because she didn't think anyone would believe her over a tenured professor with a wife who supposedly knew about the tutoring. This morning, I got an email from Professor Kelly. On the subject line, it said, "Office hours clarification," and my hands started shaking before I even opened it. He wrote that he wanted to clear up any confusion about my tutoring schedule and suggested we meet to discuss my academic trajectory going forward. The email was professional and careful, like he knew someone else might read it later. He never mentioned the harassment or the failed grade or any of the actual things that happened between us. Instead, he talked about wanting to help me succeed, and how he'd invested significant time in my development this semester. He attached a copy of his office hours log showing all those Thursday night sessions at his house with my name next to them. At the bottom, he wrote that he hoped we could resolve any misunderstandings before they escalated further. I screenshotted the email immediately and sent it to Haley. She called me 2 minutes later and told me not to respond to anything without talking to a lawyer first. My hands were still shaking when my dad knocked on my door. I had to tell him everything right then, because I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I explained about copying Haley's homework and lying about my grades and how Professor Kelly started asking me to dinner and touching my shoulder in class. My dad's face went from confused to angry to this scary kind of calm as I kept talking. When I showed him the fake tutoring records and explained I'd been working at the bookstore every Thursday night, he pulled out his phone and started making calls. The first call was to his lawyer friend who handles education cases. She said she could meet with us that afternoon and told my dad to bring all the documentation I had. The second call was to my mom, who left work immediately and drove home crying. She kept apologizing for making me feel like I couldn't tell them I was struggling, and I felt guilty all over again for lying to them for months. We met with the lawyer at 3 o'clock in her office downtown. Her name was Miss. Anderson, and she had gray hair and reading glasses on a chain. She listened to everything without interrupting and took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, she asked to see my work schedule from the bookstore and the screenshots of Professor Kelly's texts and the email he sent this morning. She spent 20 minutes reviewing everything while we sat there in silence. Finally, she looked up and said we had two separate issues that needed to be handled differently. The academic dishonesty was between me and the university, and would have consequences regardless of what happened with Professor Kelly. But the harassment and the fabricated records were serious violations that the university had a legal obligation to investigate. She said the fake tutoring documentation was particularly concerning because it showed planning and deception over months. She asked if I knew of any other students who'd experienced similar things with Professor Kelly. I told her about Lisa and how Haley was trying to get her to talk to us. Miss Anderson said multiple victims would strengthen the case significantly because it would show a pattern of behavior rather than a one-time incident. She told us the next step was reporting everything to the university's Title IX office, which handles sexual harassment complaints. She warned me that the investigation would be difficult and that Professor Kelly would probably try to use my academic dishonesty to make me look unreliable. But she said the fabricated records were objective evidence that couldn't be explained away. We left her office with a plan. The next morning, I had to meet with Ruth Connor, my academic advisor, and tell her everything. Ruth's office was in the Student Services building on the second floor. She had plants on every surface and motivational posters about persistence on the walls. I'd met with her twice before to discuss my class schedule, and she'd always been nice, but I had no idea how she'd react to this. I knocked on her door at 9 o'clock, and she smiled and gestured for me to sit down. I started explaining about the homework copying, and my voice cracked halfway through the first sentence. Ruth handed me a tissue box and waited while I pulled myself together. I told her about failing the first quiz and being scared to tell my parents and copying Haley's work. I told her about Professor Kelly keeping me after class and standing too close and touching my shoulder. I told her about the dinner invitations and the declining grades and the different final exam. By the time I got to the fake tutoring records, I was crying. So hard I could barely talk. Ruth's expression changed from concerned to angry as I kept going. When I finished, she picked up her phone and called someone without asking me first. She said she needed Melissa Fitzpatrick from the Title IX office to come to her office immediately. Melissa arrived 15 minutes later carrying a laptop and a folder. She was younger than I expected, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled back in a bun. She introduced herself and explained that she coordinates all sexual harassment investigations for the university. She asked Ruth to stay in the room as a support person, and then she started asking me questions. She wanted to know exactly when Professor Kelly first made me uncomfortable, and what specific things he said and did. She asked about the texts and the emails and the fake tutoring records. She asked about my work schedule and whether anyone could verify I was at the bookstore on Thursday nights. She took notes on her laptop and didn't react emotionally to anything I said, which somehow made it easier to keep talking. After an hour, she closed her laptop and looked at me directly. She said what Professor Kelly did was sexual harassment and that the fabricated documentation suggested he'd been planning to create a false narrative about our relationship. She explained that the investigation would take time because she'd need to interview witnesses and review records and talk to Professor Kelly. She said I should expect him to deny everything and to try to make me look like an unreliable student who was making things up to excuse my poor grades. But she also said the fake tutoring records were powerful evidence because there was no legitimate reason for him to document sessions that never happened. She asked if I knew of other students who might have similar experiences. I told her about Lisa and gave her Haley's contact information so she could help connect them. Melissa said she'd reach out to Lisa herself, and that if there were multiple victims, it would significantly strengthen the case. I left Melissa's office feeling drained, but also like I'd finally done something right. Ruth walked with me back to the main quad and told me to schedule an appointment with campus counseling services. She said talking through everything with a professional would help me process what happened and understand that none of this was my fault. I nodded and promised I would, even though the idea of explaining the whole mess again made me want to crawl into bed and hide. But 2 days later, I was sitting in a small office in the health services building across from a counselor named Dr. Brown. She had short gray hair and glasses and a calm way of listening that made it easier to talk. I told her about copying the homework and lying to my parents and how Professor Kelly had used my fear of getting caught to manipulate me. Dr. Brown didn't look shocked or disappointed. She just asked questions about how I felt during different parts of the semester and what I thought I could have done differently. When I said I should have just been honest from the start about struggling, she stopped me. She explained that my academic dishonesty and Professor Kelly's harassment were separate issues even though they happened at the same time. She said being an imperfect victim didn't make me responsible for his predatory behavior. The words hit me hard because I'd been carrying so much guilt about the homework copying that I'd started to wonder if maybe I deserved what happened. Dr. Brown said that kind of thinking was exactly what predators counted on. They looked for students who were vulnerable or had something to hide, and then they exploited that vulnerability. My lying about my grades didn't give Professor Kelly permission to harass me or fabricate records or touch my knee after the exam. Those were his choices and his responsibility. We talked for an hour, and by the end I felt lighter somehow. Like maybe I could separate the shame I felt about cheating from the violation I felt about his behavior. 3 weeks after my meeting with Melissa, Ruth called me into her office again. She had good news. The university had decided to change my organic chemistry grade from an F to an incomplete. They were going to let me take a comprehensive makeup exam with a different professor to demonstrate my actual knowledge of the material. I'd have 2 weeks to study, and the exam would cover everything from the entire semester. Ruth said this was unusual, but the investigation had revealed enough problems with Professor Kelly's grading practices that the administration wanted to give me a fair shot. I thanked her about 5 times and left her office feeling terrified and hopeful at the same time. I had 2 weeks to learn an entire semester of organic chemistry for real this time. No copying, no shortcuts, just me and the textbook and practice problems. I spent every free hour in the library working through reactions and mechanisms. Haley helped me sometimes, but this time she was teaching me instead of just giving me answers. She'd quiz me on synthesis pathways and make me explain my reasoning out loud. It was hard and frustrating, and some nights I wanted to give up. But I kept thinking about what Dr. Brown had said about earning things honestly. On the day of the makeup exam, I walked into a different professor's office with sweaty palms and a racing heart. Professor Wilson handed me the test and told me I had 3 hours. The problems were challenging but fair. They covered material we'd actually studied in class. I worked through each one carefully, showing all my steps and double-checking my answers. When I finished, I felt exhausted but also proud. I'd actually tried my best without cheating. 2 days later, Ruth emailed me my score. I got a B. Not an A like my parents expected, but a B that I'd earned through my own effort and understanding. That B felt more meaningful than any grade I'd ever received because it was real. My relationship with my parents improved slowly over the next few months. My dad stopped calling me every day to check on my grades, and my mom started asking what I actually wanted to study, instead of assuming it should be medicine. One weekend, they drove up to campus, and we had dinner at a restaurant downtown. My dad apologized for making me feel like anything less than perfect was unacceptable. He said he'd been pushing me toward medical school because he thought it would give me a secure future, but he hadn't considered whether it was what I wanted. My mom cried a little and said she was sorry for bragging to relatives about having a future doctor-daughter before asking me what my dreams were. I told them I'd been thinking about public health instead of pre-med. I liked the idea of helping communities and working on disease prevention, but I didn't want to spend my life in a hospital. They both nodded and said that sounded like a good fit. The conversation felt strange because we'd never talked this honestly before, but it also felt like maybe we could build something better than the relationship we'd had, where I lied constantly to avoid disappointing them. Professor Kelly's termination was finalized 3 months after I first reported him. Melissa called to tell me the faculty review committee had voted unanimously to uphold the administration's decision to fire him. He'd tried to appeal, but the evidence was too strong. The fake tutoring records, the fraudulent reimbursement requests, the testimony from me and Lisa, and the 2 other students who'd come forward. The university also announced new policies requiring administrative approval for any off-campus tutoring and mandatory reporting of grade patterns that suggested retaliation. They created something called a victim support fund, using money they'd recovered from Professor Kelly's fraudulent reimbursements. The fund would help students who experienced harassment pay for counseling or legal fees or other expenses related to reporting misconduct. Melissa said I should feel proud because the changes wouldn't have happened without my courage to come forward. I didn't feel particularly courageous, but I was glad other students might have better protections in the future. I'm finishing my sophomore year now with a realistic major in public health that actually interests me. My GPA recovered enough to keep my scholarship after the organic chemistry grade correction. I still have anxiety about authority figures and struggle with perfectionism. Sometimes in class, when a professor asks me a question, I freeze up and worry they're going to think I'm stupid or lying. But I'm learning to ask for help honestly when I need it. I go to the office hours and admit when I don't understand something instead of pretending I know more than I do. I'm also learning that being imperfect doesn't mean I deserve to be exploited or abused. Dr. Brown and I still meet every other week to talk through things. She's helping me understand that healing isn't linear, and that I'll probably always carry some effects from what happened. But I'm also learning that I'm stronger than I thought I was, and that speaking up was worth it even though it was terrifying.